Okay, so tonight is the final one with Soteriology 2. And then next week we're starting Soteriology 1. We're going in reverse order because that's just how the notes happen to be written. So for no other reason other than that. This one is not really dealing so much with doctrine, but more a bit of the historical aspects. Probably the most controversial of the lectures that I'm going to be giving, because it has a look at, some areas of concern, particularly around the attitude we've seen with Calvinism historically, Calvinists historically towards Arminians, which I don't think has been very Christ-like. And so when we do sort of discuss the topic, it is important to know these things, because the character of the people who propagates doctrines is important, as we'll see later. So let's see how far we go. Arminius, he was obviously the man after whom Arminianism is named. He was a very educated man, a professor of theology in Leiden, and he held that post until his death. He had originally been taught and raised in the tenets of Calvinism, and when he studied further, he came to the conclusion that he didn't agree with certain elements of what was taught in Calvinist theology. And he faced attacks from a man called Franciscus Gomarus, who was a staunch Calvinist at the same university, and he accused him of teaching Pelagian doctrines. As we've seen, that's not a valid accusation. It's a straw man argument, because Arminians have never said that you're saved by good works. We don't believe you're saved by works. We believe that you're saved by grace through faith, and that to accept a free gift from God is not a good work, because even bad people will accept good gifts. And so eventually Arminius asked for a public hearing. Unfortunately, he died before the synod convened. The synod is just a religious meeting, where leaders of the church gather to decide on doctrinal issues. And so the State General in Holland, remember at that time it was common practice for state and church not to be separated. It was more of a novel thing in America, where they, wanted separation of church and state, and it was because of the religious persecution they had faced in Europe. But it was quite common, even in those countries where they broke away from the Catholic Church, that there still would be a state church. And so in Holland, the State General requested for a 14-page paper outlining Arminius' views, but he died before this could be done. And so his followers, which were called remonstrants, replied in his stead. And they met in The Hague, and they drafted what is known as the 5 Articles of Remonstrance, which summarized his doctrine. And the Calvinists responded to that with their 5 articles, which became what we know as the tulip theology that we've been through. So it was actually originally the Arminians who came up with 5 points. And in response, and as we saw, one of those, the L in the tulip, doesn't even appear to have come from Calvin anyway. Unfortunately, there was some political maneuvering, and the Calvinists convinced the Prince, Maurice of Orange at that time, to intervene. And so he started removing Arminian magistrates from their office, and he called for a national synod, the Synod of Dort, which convened from 1618 to 19. And the old opponent of Arminius that we mentioned, Franciscus Gomarus, played a leading role. And even though it was Arminius who had actually originally called for this forum, there were 130 Calvinists present and only 13 remonstrants. So it was a bit of an uneven representation. And effectively, the remonstrants were prisoners of the state, and they were given no vote. So it was very unlikely that there'd be a vote that would be favorable to the Arminian view. No surprise. So there's just a portrait of the Synod of Dort. showing the Arminians seated at the table in the middle, and on the outside you have the Calvinists. And as I say, the Arminians didn't have a vote anyway. The Arminians were headed by a man called Simon Episcopus, and they were at a disadvantage from the start. The start. They were treated throughout as accused parties. And the synod, no surprise, because the Arminians weren't given a vote, published the condemnation of Arminius and his followers, but they denounced them as heretics. And they were very heavy-handed with the Arminians, and this is something that troubles me, because even if they believe there were theological differences, this is not how we treat people who differ theologically. And so for refusing to subscribe to the Canon of Dort, some 200 ministers, obviously Arminians, were deprived of their positions. 80 were banished from the country. Those who continued to minister were sentenced to life in prison. And Episcopius himself was deprived of his office and expelled from the country. And in 1621, in fact, some Lutheran professors at Wittenberg made this remark in a publication. I won't read the whole thing, but even the Lutherans were shocked and disgusted at the way the Calvinists responded. And they said, what good is there to be expected from such brethren may easily be gathered from the Synod of Dort and their proceedings. The Calvinists had several disputes with the Arminians, particularly about the article of grace or election, in which the latter, so that's the Arminians, defended our opinion. So the Lutherans saying they agreed with the Arminians on that point, and the former that of Calvin. In this controversy, the Calvinists showed so much heat that by a hasty decree of that synod, they condemned the Arminians and their doctrines without allowing them to make any defense, depriving them of the exercise of their religion, and banishing their most eminent ministers from their country forever. Effectively, this article by the Lutherans condemned the actions of the Calvinists in Holland. There was a statesman called Johann van Oldenbarneveld, and he had been the political protector of the Arminians. But as I pointed out, the Calvinists had managed to curry the favor with the prince. And this man was tried before a special court of 24 members, nearly all of whom were personal enemies, and he was actually beheaded on trumped-up charges of treason. Hugo Grotius was a very known Arminian lawyer at the time, and so he prepared for his own head to roll. He was arrested and placed in this castle that's shown over there, and we won't go into all the details there for the sake of time, but it is in your notes. If you read your notes, he had a very interesting escape from that in a casket with the help of his wife, and he managed to flee to another country where he continued to be a prolific writer. But the point I'm trying to bring across is that the way that these guys were treated is troubling. Fortunately, after the death of Maurice of Orange in 1625, some Arminian exiles returned, and in 1630 it was officially granted protection as a religion. But still, even though they were allowed to reside in Holland, they were not allowed to build churches until the establishment of the Batavian Republic in 1795. So up to that point, they were forced to hold their services in houses. Then just a bit about Calvin. He was born in 1509. He originally studied law, and he was attracted to the Protestant reforms of Martin Luther. And because of the fact that they were quite vocal, he and a friend of his, against the Catholic Church, they ultimately had to flee to, Calvin had to flee to Basel in Switzerland. And that's where he published the first edition of his very famous Institutes. And that was in 1536. So that's a very well-known book of his that is still read today, where it summarizes his theology. He was then persuaded by a man called William Farel to relocate to Geneva in Switzerland to reform the city. And even though he was initially rejected and expelled from the city and had to relocate to Strasbourg, he ultimately came back at their request, and he became very influential in Geneva. And so the city became the model center of Calvinism and was actually dubbed the Protestant Rome. But Calvin was a very intensely serious person. While he was in Geneva, they were very heavy-handed in terms of the ordinances and the laws that they had there. So just to give you an example, even though we might not agree with these things, I mean, they even outlawed card playing, licentious dancing, as they called it, going to the theater, drunkenness, gambling, and swearing. But it was even an offense to be absent from sermons or to criticize ministers. Family quarrels were punished. There was punishment for laughing during a sermon, or having one's fortune told, or for even praising the Pope. For some reason, even a sport like skating was something that was frowned on by him. And the attire of people was very, very conservative. Tailors were even forbidden unless they had special permission from the town authorities to follow the new fashions. Married folk were not allowed to give one another presents at the wedding or for 6 months afterwards. And by the way, that actually comes from a man who was a former Calvinist. Facts that I'm citing here. They measured the hairstyle of women to see if it was too high or too low. They counted the rings on their fingers and the pair of shoes in their closets. They even enforced dietary regulations. And, one of the things was ensuring that jams and sweets were not hidden in the kitchen. They were not allowed to make music. And Calvin even suppressed the celebration of Christmas. So there's some Christians today who follow that sort of, practice of Calvin. But I myself am not in favor of it. But he, wouldn't even have them celebrate Christmas. But, okay, those things aside, what is more troubling is the treatment of a man called Michael Servetus. Now, Michael Servetus, we're going to see, he wasn't an Orthodox Christian. In fact, we'd call him a heretic as well. But the way that he was treated, and particularly under the influence of Calvin, is something that is used often by Arminians, in their debate against Calvinists. Certainly Arminius was not a man like this. He was a scholar and appears to have been a very gentle-natured person. But Michael Servetus was actually a Spanish physician, and he was the first European who correctly described the function of pulmonary circulation. But in terms of theology, he questioned the conventional view of the Trinity and was considered as a heretic by Catholics and Protestants. So effectively, he didn't really believe that, Jesus was the eternal Son of God, but that Jesus only became the Son of God when he was born. Whereas the Bible clearly teaches, from John 1, that the Word was in the beginning with God. Not only present at the creation, he was the creator. He also opposed the practice of infant baptism, as did the Anabaptists, and we would agree with him on that, as well as Calvin's doctrine of predestination. He sent some of his manuscripts to Calvin, stating his ideas, because he was, trying to correct Calvin. And in response, Calvin sent him a copy of his book, which I told you about, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And Servetus responded then by returning the book with a lot of marginal comments where he disagreed with Calvin. And this made Calvin furious, because obviously he considered his book a masterpiece, and he was very infuriated this guy would dare write comments criticizing what he was saying. And at the time, Servetus was living under an assumed name in Vienne, in France. But we have evidence that Calvin actually manipulated behind the scenes to ensure that the Inquisition, remember the Inquisition was some initiative of the Catholics, because the Catholics were in power of France. And it appears that he made sure that they knew of Servetus' real identity and teachings. Again, very troubling. Why would a Protestant, even if he considered this man to be a heretic, make the Inquisition aware of this man's whereabouts, knowing that that could fully, result in him being killed? And in 1553, Servetus was arrested by the Catholics on charge of heresy. They initially released him due to lack of evidence, and he was subsequently rearrested, and it appears that it was Calvin who had actually furnished them with more incriminating letters, which had been sent to him, by Servetus. Servetus did manage to escape, but he was sentenced in absentia by the Catholic Church, or the Inquisition in particular, to be burned with his books, and his property and his possessions were confiscated to pay for the legal costs. And he intended to flee to Italy, but for some unknown reason, we don't know why, he stopped in Geneva, remember where Calvin was, and it almost seems like he had a death wish, because he attended a sermon by Calvin and he was recognized, and at Calvin's instigation, he was arrested, and it was Calvin who supplied the charge list that furnished the evidence that was used in his trial. He requested a lawyer. That's a reasonable request. But he was told that because he was able to lie so well, he didn't need one. And he was convicted on 2 accounts: for propagating non-Trinitarianism. Remember, I told you he had a very unorthodox view of Jesus, but also because he opposed infant baptism. And he was determined to be a heretic by the governing council of the city and burnt at the stake. And not only burnt, they used half green wood, which would burn slowly to prolong the agony. And while he was burning slowly, he cried out, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me." Now, there are some Calvinists who are aware of this, some aren't. So it is something, as I say, that it does crop up in the debate between Calvinists and Arminians. Those who are aware of it will try to downplay Calvin's role, and they will tell you, well, it was the state, not Calvin, who executed him. But remember, that's thinking with a 21st century mindset. Separation of church and state wasn't a reality in Europe at that time. The church and the state were intertwined. And so effectively, part of being a citizen was that you got baptized. That's why they took it so seriously when people didn't want to baptize their children, because effectively it was almost an insult against the state. But Calvin actually took personal responsibility for Servetus' death, and I've given more detail in the notes, so we'll cover what we can here. But in 1561, he writes in a letter, "Such monsters," he's speaking about the Anabaptists now, "should be exterminated as I have exterminated Michael Servetus, the Spaniard." So yeah, he is calling in this letter for effectively the killing of Anabaptists, because they didn't believe that you should baptize children. And he takes credit there for being responsible for the extermination of Michael Servetus. He wrote to Farrell. Remember, Farrell was the guy called into Geneva originally, 7 years prior to the execution. And speaking of Servetus, he says, "If my authority is worth anything, I will never permit him to depart alive." Speaking of Servetus, if he were to come to Geneva. And he was true to his word there. Again, yeah, you can see, where he writes, about Servetus, and he calls him the man I have destroyed. Writing to Bullinger, who is another one of the reformers, he speaks of Servetus as being the one who perished by my hands. Bullinger was actually the man who succeeded Zwingli in Zurich. And so it was at Calvin's instigation that Servetus was arrested. He supplied the charges. And when he writes in another letter, he says that at my instigation, ordered him to be committed to prison, for I do not dissemble that I deemed it my duty to restrain as much as lay in my power a man who was worse than obstinate and ungovernable, lest the infection should spread more widely. And even though the charges against Servetus were submitted by Calvin's secretary, both Calvin and Theodore Beza, who was his successor, admitted that it actually originated from Calvin. And I'm not going to read all of these, time won't allow. But yeah, again, I'm just citing different, works of Calvin and letters of Calvin where he takes responsibility. So while Calvinists today will say, well, it wasn't Calvin, it was the state, Calvin, in his own words, said it was me. Now, there are others who try to defend Calvin's actions, and they say that in any event, the Catholics wanted to kill Servetus first. Now, that's true. As I pointed out, the Inquisition was after him, and they wanted to burn him for heresy, the Catholics. But what kind of a defense is that? The Catholic Inquisition, if you know anything about it, wanted to kill any Protestant they could lay their hands on, including Calvin. If Calvin himself had fled. So it seems strange that a man himself who had fled the wrath of the Catholics would betray another person, even if he thought he was a heretic, to these very people. And we criticize the Inquisition for what they did. So how can we criticize the Inquisition and then defend Calvin for the same thing? And as I pointed out, it was only with Calvin's assistance that the Catholics in France anyway were able to charge Servetus, because he supplied the information and he, effectively let them know the whereabouts of Servetus. We, are aware of the fact that Calvin supplied incriminating material via a third party to the Inquisition, working through a friend. And he did all that knowing full well that the Inquisition, based on the information he'd given them, would put Servetus to death. Now, Servetus did escape, but I mean, we have Calvin supplying evidence to the Catholic Church, who supposedly, he had broken away from, giving them evidence to have Servetus effectively burned at the stake. And so Servetus would denounce Calvin at the trial at Vienne as the instigator. And later during the trial at Geneva, he reproached Calvin with treachery. And as I pointed out, what Calvin did here is especially contemptible, since he was, by Catholic standards, himself a heretic. And the Inquisition would have treated him the same if they'd got hold of him. Then there are those who rationalize Calvin's heavy-handed tactics by saying that he attempted to get Servetus to recant. So in other words, they say, well, he did try to get Servetus to change his opinion, and he would have preferred that to the execution of this man. But again, that's a bit of a poor defense, because that's what the Inquisition used to do as well. Before the Inquisition would burn you at the stake, they would also give you the opportunity to recant. And if you denounced being a Protestant and, came back to the fold of Catholicism, you'd also be pardoned. So what he was doing there is hardly to be commended, because no one commends the Catholics for doing that. And so they would say that Calvin wanted Servetus to recant and not die. And yet Calvin expressed his real desire to Farel, because during the trial he wrote to Farel, I hope that sentence of death will at least be passed on him. And he believed, like the Catholics believed, that heretics should be, punished by death. The only difference was, obviously, his definition of heresy was different to the Catholics. But he writes to these irreligious characters and despisers of the heavenly doctrines. And at length matters had come to such a state that an end could be put to their machinations in no other way than cutting them off by an ignominious death, which was indeed a painful and pitiful spectacle to me. They no doubt deserved the severest punishment, etc., etc. So he was of the opinion that heretics should be put to death by the state. He was also uncooperative when Servetus asked him to return the manuscript on which he had made the comments. Remember, I told you he got offended by the fact that Servetus had made comments. So Servetus just asked for that manuscript to see the comments he had made. He obviously couldn't remember everything, and he obviously wanted to try justify what he had written or explain. Now, remember, he had been denied a lawyer, and so he was just attempting to prepare his own defense and naturally wanted to see what he had written. But Calvin denied him that. And despite the pleas of Servetus, it appears that Calvin had developed an intense dislike for this man during the correspondence, and he refused to return any of the incriminating material. Now, another attempt that is made by modern Calvinists to sanitize what Calvin did, they'll point out that Calvin did request a more humane death for Servetus. He did request beheading rather than burning. Remember, I told you they not only burnt the man, they burnt him slowly. So at first, this does seem to indicate some humanity on Calvin's part. But, that notion disappears if you read his seemingly heartless comments to a friend about Servetus' response on pronouncement of his sentence. So this is what he said about the man's reaction when he was pronounced a heretic and condemned to be burned at the stake. He writes, "But lest idle scoundrels should glory in the insane obstinacy of the man, as in a martyrdom, there appeared in his death a beastly stupidity, whence it might be concluded that on the subject of religion he never was in earnest. When the sentence of death had been passed upon him," this is Calvin writing, "he stood fixed now as one astounded, now he sighed deeply, and now he howled like a maniac. And at length he just gained strength enough to bellow out after the Spanish manner, and he cried out for mercy in Spanish." They're almost taunting this man who obviously, on receiving the death sentence, was very shaken up. And Calvin actually said that we should actually suppress any natural affection. So any natural feeling of mercy should be suppressed. Because he says that God makes plain that the false prophet is to be stoned without mercy. We are to crush beneath our heel all affections of nature when his honor is concerned. Then we are told by some that this was an isolated incident. So only one guy was killed. So it's actually not that serious. But if we look at history, it was not an isolated incident. This might have been the worst. But in the first 5 years of Calvin's rule in Geneva, there were 58 people executed and 76 exiled for their religious beliefs. Now, that doesn't mean that he was directly involved in all of those, but we see that he was a very influential figure in Geneva. He was often called, as in the case of Michael Servetus, to furnish the charges and would be involved somehow in the trial. So those who try and make out that he didn't really have a major part in what was happening there underestimate the influence of Calvin in Geneva. There was an earlier case with the libertine, Jacques Gruet. Now, obviously, as a libertine, he clearly wasn't a man who was a Christian. In fact, he was known to be an obstinate and a disagreeable person. But he made the mistake of attaching a note to Calvin's pulpit calling him a hypocrite. Not a very nice thing to do. And he was heard uttering threats against Calvin and was implicated in state treason. And this man was arrested, tortured every day for a month, and then beheaded in 1547. There was the libertine Pierre Armand, who hated Calvin's theology and discipline, and at a party where he was a bit intoxicated, he abused Calvin verbally. And for this offense, he was imprisoned by the council for 2 months and condemned to a fine of $60. Now, this man made an apology and retracted his words, but Calvin wasn't satisfied and demanded a second trial. And there he was condemned to a more degrading punishment. So, yeah, again, you see the influence of Calvin. If Calvin had no influence whatsoever, how is it that if he was unhappy with the outcome of a trial and asked for another one, they complied? And at the second trial, this man was condemned to a more degrading punishment where he had to parade through the streets in his shirt with bare head and a lighted torch in his hand and ask on bended knees the pardon of God, of the council, and of Calvin. And in fact, this judgment provoked a popular outbreak in one of the quarters of the city. There were two preachers who had actually taken part in this drinking scene mentioned above, and they were deposed. And one of them had said before the council that Calvin was a good and virtuous man and of great intellect, but sometimes governed by his passions, impatient, full of hatred, and vindictive. James Bolsek was a former Catholic who converted to Protestantism, but he didn't believe in Calvin's doctrine of predestination, which I don't believe in anyway. He considered it to be absurd. And at a public discussion in Geneva, he interrupted the orator who was speaking on predestination, and he argued against him. He wasn't aware that Calvin was actually in the meeting, and so he was surprised when Calvin subsequently stood up and then refuted his argument. But subsequent to that, this man was arrested, placed on trial, charged with attacking the religious establishment of Geneva, and banished permanently from the city. Calvin also considered the Anabaptists to be heretics. The reason being that the Anabaptists opposed the unbiblical practice of infant baptism. They believed, as do we, that you don't baptize babies. Jesus said, baptize in those who believe. Go into the world, preach the gospel, baptize in those who believe. No one can believe on your behalf. So nowhere does Scripture advocate the fact that your parents can believe for you. As it's been said, God only has children, he doesn't have grandchildren. But nevertheless, he considered the Anabaptists to be heretics, and he actively persecuted them and encouraged others to do the same. And in 1561, in a letter that he wrote to a man who was a chamberlain to the King of Navarre regarding the Anabaptists, he says, above all, do not fail to rid the country of those scoundrels. These are Christians, Anabaptists, who believe in adult believers' baptism, who stir up the people to revolt against us. Such monsters should be exterminated as I have exterminated Michael Servetus, the Spaniard. I alluded to that earlier on. So here he's calling for these men to be exterminated as he has exterminated Servetus. What happened to Servetus? He was burnt at the stake. When he writes to Farrell, he talks of a man in Geneva called Bello, who was an Anabaptist. And he says that at my instigation, he was arrested and expelled from the city because this man was dispensing of writings, obviously promoting the doctrines of the Anabaptists. 2 days later, they found him again in the city, and so he was beaten, his books publicly burned, and he was told not to come again on penalty of the gallows. Then some Calvinists, like James White, will tell you that Servetus had a disregard for Calvin's safety, that Calvin risked his life to meet him in Paris many years earlier. And remember, Calvin was a wanted man in France. He had fled from France. And they say that even though Calvin went, Servetus stood him up. So effectively, Servetus was putting Calvin's life at danger. The truth is, we don't know why Servetus stood him up. We don't have any reason. We don't know if it was deliberate, what the reason was. We do know that Calvin deliberately put Servetus, Servetus' life in jeopardy by revealing the information to the Inquisition and the whereabouts of Servetus. So in the case of Calvin, we have quite clear evidence that it was deliberate. In this case, we don't really know the motivation for Servetus not making this meeting. Now, there are those who try to tell you, well, killing people for differences of opinion in religious matters, it was just common practice in the day. And so it was acceptable. So we are told that, well, everybody did it. So therefore, it wasn't unusual, and he was just following the common practice of his day. Therefore, we have to view it in that light. David Bennett says on that, using that logic is like saying the apostles should have converted people by the sword and crucifixion, because that was the way things were done at that time. The everybody else is doing it argument never worked on my parents when I was growing up. The Bible tells us we are to be in the world, not of the world. But if you're going to use that kind of logic to defend Calvin's actions, then why don't you use it against the Catholic Inquisition? So nobody tries to defend the Catholic Inquisition and says, well, it was common practice in that era. So the fact that they burnt a couple of Protestants at the stake, well, we can overlook it because, it's just the way things were done. People criticize the Inquisition for doing it, and rightfully so. You cannot criticize the Inquisition for burning Protestants because they considered them heretics, and then defend Calvin for burning Servetus because he thought he was a heretic, even if he was a heretic. According to the Catholics, the Protestants were heretics. It's also not true that Calvin's actions were simply accepted in his day, because there were those who criticized Calvin for what he did. The Reformed French preacher and former friend of Calvin, Sebastian Castellio, said when Servetus fought with reason and writings, he should have been repulsed by reasons and writings. In other words, Servetus wasn't taking up arms against them. He was writing against their doctrine, and he said that the response should have been in like manner, by reason and writings, not by killing the man. And in fact, Castellio invoked the testimony of church fathers like Augustine, Chrysostom, and Jerome to support freedom of thought. And he even used Calvin's own words, written back when he himself was being persecuted by the Catholic Church. It is unchristian to use arms. This is what Calvin had formerly said. It is unchristian to use arms against those who have been expelled from the church, and to deny them rights common to all mankind. So Calvin changed his tune when he was in a position of authority. This man over here, with the name that's very difficult to pronounce, Julia Musgratorolus, or whatever, doubt that that's a correct pronunciation, but he was an Italian physician who was a religious refugee in Basel since 1549, and he wrote to Bullinger that many people, even those who were not supporters of Servetus' ideas, they agreed that Servetus, was heretical, blamed Calvin for the death of Servetus. And he said that in Basel, many prominent and learned people who in discussing the case of Servetus considered Calvin a butcher. So it's not true. That is just the way things were done and everybody accepted it as the norm. André Zebedee, the pastor of Noyen, wrote to Calvin denouncing the sentence. He declared that while the fires of the Spanish Inquisition were outdone by those in France, those at Geneva outdid them both. Okay, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but still, he's effectively telling Calvin that he's behaving worse than the Catholic Inquisition. The former Catholic turned reformer, Pierre Vergeria, wrote to Bullinger that the drama of Servetus horrified him. Though he hated such disturbers of the church, he opposed the death penalty. And the Sicilian poet, Camilla Renata, wrote to Calvin, highlighting the fact that Jesus never reacted to opposition in the way that Calvin had. And he says to Calvin, your cruelty, Calvin, is not worthy of the ferocious beasts. Don't you realize that the error subsists and spreads when one exterminates a heretic? Neither God nor his Spirit have counseled such an action. Christ did not treat those who negated him that way. Was it not he who burst into anger against his disciples who wanted to set Samaria afire? So he uses the very example of where James and John want to call down fire on the town, the Samaritan town that wouldn't let Jesus go through, and Jesus rebuked them. Calvin responded to the critics, and he wasn't particularly worried about what they said. And in fact, he refers to them as dogs and swine. And he says some object that since the offense consists only in words, there is no need for such severity. But we muzzle dogs, and shall we leave men free to open their mouths as they please? Those who object are like dogs and swine. They murmur that they will go to America where no one will bother them. And he writes that he rejoices in the fact that they spit in my face. In other words, he was aware of the fact that he was criticized for what he did, and there was no sign of any remorse. He didn't reflect later and say, well, maybe I was a bit hasty or heavy-handed. He was equally obnoxious to his critics. And in fact, he said that they are worthy of the same fate as heretics. Whoever shall now contend that it is unjust to put heretics and blasphemous to death will knowingly and willingly incur their very guilt. And so those who try to say, well, Calvin was just, participating in the culture of the time, must take note that he wasn't just an innocent bystander in a violent culture. He was actively promoting the violence. And when he writes to Francis, King of the French in 1536, he says, I fear not to declare that what I have here given may be regarded as a summary of the very doctrine which they vociferate ought to be punished with confiscation, exile, imprisonment, and flames, as well as exterminated by land and sea. And Servetus, the man who was burnt at the stake, said, it seems to me a grave error to kill a man only because he might be in error, interpreting some question of the scripture, when we know that even the most learned are not without error. And as I pointed out earlier in his life, Calvin had written that the death penalty for heresy was unjust, and that heretics should not be punished, at least with harshness. And yet he clearly changed his opinion as he aged and as he got into power at Geneva. And when he himself was persecuted, he was a man who propagated toleration, clemency, rather than vengeance. but that changed with time. And so it seems that as he gained political influence, his behavior was no different from that of the Catholic Church that he condemned. Servetus correctly pointed out in his trial that there'd been no criminal prosecution for doctrinal disagreement in the early church. And even when the church, well, it didn't even become the state religion under Constantine, as people say. It was only under Theodosius. But Constantine just legalized Christianity. But in Constantine's day, the worst punishment for a heretic was that they were banished. And we have Arius, for example, who was also non-Trinitarian, like Servetus, and he was banished by the emperor. When the Council of Nicaea deemed him to be a heretic, they didn't kill him, they banished the man, and ultimately you find that he was allowed to return home. I'm just going to go a bit faster here. Philip Schaff is a very renowned church historian, and he points out the same thing that I've made you're aware of, that Calvin took responsibility for what happened to Servetus. And according to Schaff, he showed personal bitterness towards Servetus during the trial. And we find that Martin Luther had a different attitude towards heretics. Martin Luther wrote that the burning of heretics is contrary to the will of the Holy Spirit. So a very different opinion from Martin Luther on how heretics should be handled. And bearing in mind that in Germany, effectively, the Lutheran Church also became the state church. He wrote in his To the Christian Nobility, if it were scholarly to conquer heretics with fire, then the henchmen would be the most learned doctors on earth. And when he comments on the parable of the tares, he obviously, interprets it as we do, that the sowing of the tares is the sowing of false doctrine, of heresy. And he says, as to heretics and false doctors, we must not pluck them out or destroy them. Christ tells us plainly to allow them grow. The word of God is our resource. So in that parable, remember when they asked the master, what should we do? He tells them, no, don't burn them. You wait till the harvest. So the point that Luther is making there is that if we follow what Jesus has said in this parable, heretics are not to be burned. We're to wait for God to be the judge of those issues. And so Lutheran author Jürgen, I think it's Neve, writes, Calvin's mistake was his refusal to recognize the freedom of conscience. In his dealing with teachers of false doctrine within the church, Christ speaks of excommunication after previous brotherly admonition, but neither he nor the apostles have commanded that they are to be put to death. Calvin's practice was a return to medieval methods, which Luther had characterized ironically with the remark, with a death sentence, they solve all argumentation. So Luther had said that that's the way Catholics sorted out arguments. They gave you the death sentence, argument finished. And that's how Calvin seemed to think you solved an argument. And I'm going to skip over this as well. Luther, just on another issue, wrote many hymns for the church, but in contrast, Calvin prohibited the use of musical instruments in the church. And so you'd find that there's still some churches today who follow that practice, and they won't even have musical instruments, and they don't want to sing any of the modern songs. They'll only sing psalms. And it's strange that although he considered the Old Testament to be a dispensation of shadows and figures, when it comes to his treatment of heretics, he bases it not on the New Testament practice, but on the Mosaic law. So his argument against music was, well, that was Old Testament. The people singing and praising and, all the things that you find in the Old Testament. So we don't need to follow that because it's Old Testament. Yet when it came to the treatments of heretics, he advocated the practice in the old covenant of burning, or not burning, of killing heretics, the Mosaic law. Very inconsistent. And so he points to the Old Testament and he says God has explicitly instructed us to kill heretics. So now all of a sudden he's an old covenant man. When it came to music, he was new covenant. But Jesus said that his kingdom is not of this world. And he said, if it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. So he said, the kingdom of this world. He rebuked Peter, remember, when he tried to defend him using a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so just to quickly look at the way the New Testament tackles this issue, how are we supposed to tackle heresy? There's no record in the New Testament of religiously condoned physical violence by Christians against other groups, which could be used as any precedent. It's not the way Jesus acted. It's not the way the apostles acted. In fact, they were at the receiving end of those who often persecuted and put them to death. It's not the actions of Christians. We don't convert or discipline by the sword. Christianity should not be embraced for political or social advantage. Jesus should be sought for his own sake. We often criticize Islam, saying that that's how they spread their word, was through the sword. They went to countries and they converted by the sword. You either became a Muslim or else you had your head chopped off. That's not the way we propagate the gospel. We spread the gospel by love and example. And so, how do we reach the enemies of Christianity? We're told to love them. Love your enemies, Jesus said, do good to them. And he says that God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. And so we ought to be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Peter tells us that when we share our faith, we do it with gentleness and respect, not with torture and coercion. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, not by burning them at the stake if they disagree with you. And so when it comes to church discipline, what do you do when you've got sin in the church? Well, if we look at Jesus, he told us in this passage over here, you should know it. He talks about you having an offense, your brother sinned against you. He says you first go to your brother, just the two of you, and perhaps you might win him over. Jesus said if he doesn't listen, then you take one or two others along. And then if he still refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And then if he still refuses to listen to the church, he says, then treat him as you would a pagan or tax collector. So even at the most extreme point there, it's excommunication, not death. Paul also taught excommunication for the unrepentant Christian. And clearly, Paul shows that the goal is actually being restorative, not punitive, not punishing them. And so when there's this man in the Corinthian church who's living in blatant sexual sin, and Paul tells him to put him out of fellowship. And he says, hand this man over to Satan. Now that sounds severe, but what is the intention? He says, so that the sinful nature may be destroyed and his spirit saved on the day of the Lord. The intention was actually that this man might realize his error and repent, which is actually what happened. Because we find that in 2 Corinthians, this man has now repented and they don't want to take him back into the church. And Paul has to write to them and say, no, the man's repented, take him back. And so excommunication or disfellowship is not just for the sexually immoral. We are told in 1 Corinthians 5, you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or a slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler. And Paul makes it clear he's not talking about the unsaved, because he said otherwise you'd have to leave the world. But he says if a person claims to be a Christian, and yet it's known that they're sexually immoral, greedy, a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler, you mustn't even eat with such a man. The principle of disfellowship also applies to false teachers. And so in 2 John, He says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, the one that he's just referred to, do not take him into your house or welcome him. Anyone who welcomes him shares in his wicked work. So this practice in the early church, at the most extreme, as I say, the initial point is speaking to the person, trying to resolve it, taking witnesses, taking it to the church. If all those fail, the extreme method that was used in the early church was disfellowship. And even then, the intention, as we saw in the case of the Corinthian man who was disfellowshipped, was to ultimately restore him, if possible. And so Titus is told to silence false teachers, not by torture or by death, but by rebuking them and by refuting them with sound doctrine. And that's what we do. If people, false doctrine, it's not a problem to refute them with sound doctrine. Some people get offended when you do that, but we are told to do that. Encourage others by sound doctrine, refute those who oppose it. And he talks about people who are teaching, that you have to keep the law and be circumcised. And he says they must be silenced. But never are we told they must be killed. And if Calvin had maybe read some of these verses, perhaps there would be a different outcome in what happened with Michael Servetus. Timothy is told, when he's in Ephesus, by Paul, command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer. So Paul tells Timothy, command them not to teach heresy. Nothing wrong with that. Divisive people are also to be avoided after repeated warnings. Romans 16 verse 17, Paul says, I urge you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. And he says, keep away from them. So again, we find this principle again and again. Titus 3 verse 10, he says, warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. So again, we see, as Jesus said, you do give warnings, and there needs to be more than one warning, but if the warnings are always ignored, we are told to disfellowship them, have nothing to do with them. And so if Calvin considered men to be divisive, this was the New Testament approach he should have followed. Keep away from them, have nothing to do with them. Silence them. He could have silenced them, but the silencing them is not by killing them. It is by not giving them, access to the pulpit. And as I pointed out, the intention of disfellowship is restoration, as we see in the case of the Corinthians. Now, lastly, we are told by Calvinists today that even if Calvin was wrong in this matter, we can't dismiss his doctrinal views because of that. But you know how Jesus told us to test prophets? He didn't say by reading their doctrine. He said by their fruit you will know them. In other words, by the way they live, their character and actions. We get many men today who claim to be prophets and apostles and whatever of God, and if you look at the way they live, and that's how Jesus said, we test them. He said, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. He said, by their fruit you will recognize them. In other words, by the way they live. Jesus said that a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. In other words, if a man is producing bad fruit, Jesus says that's how you test whether a man's a false prophet or not. What is good fruit that you'd expect to see in a prophet of God? Well, the fruit of the Spirit, we are told in Galatians 5, is love, kindness, gentleness. So judge for yourselves. As I say, some people might think I'm being quite severe here. Were the actions of Calvin those of a sheep or of a wolf? In his handling of Servetus, did he display good fruit that you're told about, love, kindness, gentleness, or the opposite? And then remember that Jesus said, a bad tree produces bad fruit. And a good tree cannot bear bad fruit. And so in conclusion, modern Anabaptist author and speaker Benjamin Corrie aptly comments, why in the world would I want to build the totality of my Christian theology on a foundation erected by such a person? If Calvin didn't understand something so basic as torturing and killing people is something a Jesus follower probably shouldn't do, I have zero confidence that he even understood the more complex theological issues.